You had neoliberal Democrats losing an election to one of the worst candidates ever, a reality TV show talk host. And then instead of taking responsibility for their own failures, both the policies that led to a lot of disenchantment with them and also their dumb campaign decisions, like, not campaigning in Wisconsin and Michigan in the final months, and running ads that were very short on policy and mostly about attacking Trump's character. So I hope that it's recognized that basically Russia was used as a convenient foil, a scapegoat for their own failures. And it was a refusal to reflect on these failures that then propelled this ongoing fixation with Russian meddling and upset and turning serious journalists into just fanatic conspiracy theorists, willing to believe anything. And no matter how many mistakes they made in the process, refusing to let go of it.
Hey everybody, welcome to the 163rd episode of Primo Nutmeg. On today's show, my guest is Aaron Maté. He is a journalist who writes for The Nation, as well as an expert on the corporate media's fixation on Russia. Today we're going to cover all aspects of the Russiagate conspiracy theory. We're going to talk about U.S.-Russia relations, accusations that Russia meddled in the 2016 presidential election, accusations that Donald Trump colluded with Russia, and run over who has been indicted and convicted thus far in the Robert Mueller investigation. Folks, you aren't going to want to miss 1 second of this interview with Aaron Maté. While you're listening, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Also, please write a review on iTunes and Facebook. And please remember that the only way that we keep this show going is through the generosity of our patrons. For that reason, please do consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg. For only $1 a month, you'll get access to hours and hours of forgotten content from our earlier seasons. And you'll also get access to some exclusive patron-only content. Thanks everyone for listening, and now without any further ado, here's my interview with Aaron Maté. Aaron Maté, welcome to Primo Nutmeg.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is probably one of the best times to have you on the show. I've wanted to have you on for a while, but this week with the BuzzFeed news story and then last night prior to us recording, Mueller's office rebuffing those claims, it's really a good time to have you on. So as I mentioned before the call, I wanted to kind of break down all of Russiagate into three categories as I see them. First, the accusations of Russian meddling in the 2016 election, including the WikiLeaks and DNC emails, accusations of Russian trolling and all of the related claims around that. Then also the accusations of Trump collusion. And then finally, all of the miscellaneous crimes related to that. But again, just because the news this past week was so big with the BuzzFeed accusations of Cohen supposedly saying that Trump asked him to lie to Congress, and then Mueller's office actually refuting those claims yesterday, could you maybe just go over explaining exactly what was in that BuzzFeed news article and how significant it is for Mueller's office to say that those statements were false?
Sure. So the BuzzFeed story, which came out Thursday night, claimed that Mueller has evidence that Donald Trump directed Michael Cohen to lie to Congress about the Moscow project, which was an effort by the Trump organization to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. And Cohen has already pled guilty to lying to Congress about that project. And BuzzFeed said that Mueller had figured out that Trump had lied from documents, emails, text messages, witnesses, and then Michael Cohen had confirmed it in testimony himself. And this fueled, immediate calls for impeachment proceedings, because if Trump indeed directed Cohen to lie to Congress, that's an impeachable offense. And so this pretty much dominated the news cycle for 24 hours. You had it discussed nonstop on cable news. Now, on the surface, there were already many reasons to doubt this story, which I laid out on Twitter pretty quickly, and others did as well. And we can get into those if you want. But amazingly, for the first time, Mueller came out and denied a story. He denied this one. He said it was not true. And that is significant because there have been so many stories and Mueller has stuck to a policy of just being quiet and saying nothing. So the fact that he came out so forcefully on this one was major and a huge embarrassment, not just for BuzzFeed, but for all the media outlets that took that already very sketchy story on faith and hyped it up into something that it just clearly was not.
So, yeah, I mean, this seems to be a trend that we've seen throughout the past couple of years where there's these accusations made and then they're either walked back or disproven and then kind of forgotten about. And there's just so many different topics to go through. So, again, I thought maybe first off, we could talk about the accusations of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. And the hypothesis there is that Russia wanted Hillary Clinton to lose or they wanted to undermine faith in US democracy. And what's confusing about this for me from the start is just looking back to US Russia relations, because with the Cold War coming to an end in the early 90s and the friendliness between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, and also the US interference in the 1996 Russian election where we propped up Yeltsin, and just the past couple decades of friendliness between the US and Russia, it's kind of strange to see this. And actually, in the 2012 election, what many people seem to forget is that a main line of attack by the Democrats against Mitt Romney was that he said Russia was our number one geopolitical foe. And this is something that Democrats really scoffed at and laughed at and made fun of Romney for. So what happened? What was the main cause for the falling out between Russia and the U.S. between 2012 and 2016?
On the Russian side, the U.S. intervention in Libya was a huge source of tension because the U.S. secured. Now, Putin was out of power, so it was Medvedev who was in power in Russia, and the U.S. secured Russia's support for a UN Security Council resolution in support of a no-fly zone in Libya back in 2011 because there was fear that Muammar Gaddafi's forces were going to commit a massacre in Benghazi. That was the stated aim of the intervention of the resolution, which also called for negotiations between the Libyan government and the rebels. Now, the U.S. and its allies in France and Britain, they imposed the no-fly zone, but then proceeded to go far beyond it by also bombing Gaddafi's forces and basically intervening on the side of the rebels. And they also flouted the part of the resolution that called for negotiations. So to Russia, this led to the toppling of Gaddafi and Gaddafi being sodomized and killed. And so for Russia, this was a huge betrayal. And Putin has been quoted saying that he would never trust the West again, something along those lines. So, tensions built there. And then Ukraine in 2013, 2014 was also a huge flashpoint. And that's a complicated issue. But in short, you had a president, Yanukovych, who was kind of playing both sides. He was friendly to Russia, but he also was friendly to the EU. But then he also had disputes with both sides. And basically, he was under a lot of pressure to sign some sort of trade agreement because Ukraine was suffering some serious economic problems, and he was close to signing it with the EU. But this was back when austerity was, not that it's not now, but back then especially, austerity was really in style when it came to the EU. It's what they were also imposing on Greece at the time. And so the EU demanded really harsh austerity measures on Ukraine for it to sign a trade pact with Yanukovych. And Yanukovych panicked because he thought that would spell doom for his government because he would force, fuel hikes and other harsh austerity measures on his people. So he didn't think that would bode well for his chances of winning re-election. So then Russia came in and offered him another deal, which he then moved to accept. That triggered protests from people who wanted to join the EU. And the U.S. then came in and played a pretty big role in stoking the unrest here. We had John McCain coming to visit and other U.S. lawmakers. Victoria Nuland, a U.S. State Department official at the time, there was a leaked phone call where she talks about basically orchestrating the installation of a new president to replace Yanukovych. So, and this ultimately led to Yanukovych's ouster and the installation of a new government in Ukraine. And then meanwhile, Putin saw all this, and you can argue that he overreacted, and acted aggressively. But what he did was basically he saw the prospect of Ukraine, a country on his border, possibly joining NATO, because that had been discussed for a while by the people who came into power. And so Putin moved pretty quickly and seized Crimea, and that led to new sanctions on Russia, and coupled that with tensions over Syria, where Russia intervened in 2015 after the U.S. intervened, and like you just had this deterioration of relations. That's the background, and of course, I'm giving a very broad sketch of what happened, but that's pretty much that's an overview. So, taking us to the 2016 election, you had Trump, who was calling for better relations with Russia, pretty much defying the entire U.S. political establishment and alarming them because, for their own reasons, not because I think that Russia is an actual existential threat to the U.S., but because tensions with Russia are profitable for the national security state. It's kind of how many of them justify salaries at think tanks and weapons contracts. There was alarm about Trump's call for better relations, and Hillary Clinton was promoting the same hawkish policies. And then you had someone steal Democratic Party emails, which was then blamed on Russia. And we can talk about what the evidence is for that or not, but the point is, whether Russia stole the emails or not, certainly the fact that they were accused of doing so has been used to perpetuate these very dangerous tensions between the two sides.
So yeah, I mean, let's take the accusations of direct Russian interference. So there's a few different components of that. There's the WikiLeaks emails that came out, and the accusation, I guess, that Russia may have played a role in handing those over to WikiLeaks. That is also coupled with the DNC leak and Guccifer 2.0. And then you also have the accusations of fake news, and that being spread either through Russian outlets like RT and Sputnik, and then also the social media trolls and Facebook ads. And I believe that there's actually been some indictments around that. So is there anything that you could say to refute that? And also, I mean, have those intelligence agencies provided any evidence for any of those accusations?
I think the only significant piece of this is the stolen emails, because somebody did steal Democratic Party emails from the DNC and from John Podesta's. Someone did it, and they came out. And I personally don't think that they swung the race, but they were damaging. Like they did show that the party leadership was biased against Bernie Sanders. And they highlighted the discrepancies between Hillary Clinton's private statements to Wall Street, for example, and her public statements. So they were damaging. I don't think they were like fatally damaging, but they were damaging. And I think that they're significant. What is not significant, I think, is the social media angle, which to me is a joke. I mean, we're talking about a Russian troll farm called the Internet Research Agency, which is basically a marketing firm. And there's been so much energy and time devoted to trying to prove that this is some kind of sophisticated Russian meddling operation. But if you look at all the posts that they actually put out, it's clickbait trash, and it's obvious what their motive was. It was to appeal to certain targeted demographics, build up followers, and you use your followings to then sell to advertisers on your platforms. It's standard clickbait stuff. Now, it looks like they probably had a preference for Donald Trump, but it's like, who cares? The amount of like the sophistication of the ads was like they were so juvenile, and their reach was so small. There's been all these inflated numbers about how many people they saw, but all those numbers are based on basically spins on estimates. And most of the ads, the Facebook ads, for example, ran after the 2016 elections. Most of them were not about the candidates. They were about social issues. So the idea that they could have an impact on the election is really a joke. And it's one stark illustration of how there's been, I think, a huge American disinformation campaign in the U.S. about Russian disinformation, trying to get people to think that they're victims of Russian disinformation. And I've written about this extensively at The Nation magazine, and we could talk about it more if you'd like, but that's a broad overview. In terms of the emails, look, from the beginning, I've said that, I wouldn't be surprised if Russia did steal the emails, because, it's obvious why they would prefer Trump in office, because Trump was calling for better relations with them. So it wouldn't surprise me if they had done that. But my sort of fundamental point on this question all along is that we don't just take intelligence community claims on faith. We don't live in a totalitarian society where whatever the government says, whatever unelected government officials tell us is true. We just don't do that. We need to see evidence. And for so long throughout this, there has been no evidence. There's been the claims of a private firm called CrowdStrike, which was hired by the DNC, but they have a sketchy past of their own, and literally they're a DNC contracted firm. So even their evidence amounted to a couple of blog posts. There has not been extensive evidence. Now, Mueller did indict in July 2018. He did indict Russian military intelligence officers, and he accused them. And his indictment claims to show Russian officers specifically setting up fake names and carrying out specific actions as part of this theft. So I think that should be taken very, very seriously. But the one thing there is I'll say is that we have not seen the underlying evidence upon which Mueller's claims are based. And according to reporting, this evidence of Russian military intelligence still in the emails likely came from European intelligence agencies. Well, we've been through a similar scenario before where European intelligence agencies supplied evidence that turned out to be not true. I'm talking about the Iraq War, which, the British dossier that laid the basis for claims of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, and this claim that Iraqis met with Mohammed Atta, one of the 9/11 hijackers in Prague, also came from European intelligence. So that doesn't mean that now they've gotten it wrong, and it's very well possible that it was Russian military intelligence hackers who stole the emails, but I'm just not convinced of that yet, based on what we've seen so far.
So just one last question on the overall accusation of general Russian meddling. Who is Maria Butina, and why was she indicted and convicted?
Maria Butina is part of a weird fringe pro-gun group in Russia where they really want to bring guns to Russia. She was very involved in it, and she's obviously very passionate about it. Now, the Russian government is very opposed to what her group was doing, which is one of the reasons why the accusations against her here in the U.S. now that she's working with the Russian government, the Kremlin, are so questionable. And basically, she was arrested last year on charges of being an unregistered foreign agent because she went to a bunch of Republican and NRA meetings and tried to make connections and organize visits to Russia without registering with the Justice Department, as you're required to do if you're acting as a foreign agent. Now, this was spun by both the prosecutors and the news media in the U.S. To mean that she's some sort of high-level Russian spy. And there were all these stories about, was Butina there to act as a conduit between the Kremlin and Trump, or a conduit between the Kremlin and the NRA? And was she funneling Russian money to Trump? And there was all this wild stuff. And prosecutors suggested that she had traded sex in return for a job, but it turned out to all be it was garbage. It was garbage. It was basically she was in the U.S. trying to pursue her pro-gun agenda and make connections with the NRA and with Republicans. But basically, she was targeted, I think, because she's Russian. And it is true that she was in contact and she worked with a Russian government official, this guy Torshin, who worked in the Russian central bank. But I mean, this notion that means that she was working on behalf of the Kremlin in a secret plot is totally unsupported by the evidence. And prosecutors backed off basically all their most salacious claims against her. And her final plea deal was basically her pleading to not registering with the Justice Department on it. So it's one count, and she'll probably be deported. But it's a case where, again, because it's Russia, because it's Trump, it was spun into something infinitely larger than it actually was.
Hey everybody, thanks again for listening to this interview with Aaron Maté on Primo Nutmeg. I just wanted to quickly remind everyone to please like, share, and subscribe. Please tell your friends about Primo Nutmeg. Maybe share this episode in particular. And also, please remember that the only way to keep this show going is through your generosity. Please do consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg. Once again, there, for only $1 a month, you'll get access to hours and hours of forgotten content from our earlier seasons. And you'll also get access to some exclusive patron-only content. Thanks again, everyone. And now let's get back to this interview with Aaron Maté.
So moving into the accusations of Trump collusion, one of the first big claims comes from the Steele dossier that Trump, managing the Miss Universe contest in Moscow years ago, that he paid for prostitutes and that the Russian government got compromise on him and because of that, he would do their bidding. So could you just maybe walk over what the story behind the Steele dossier is? Is there any hard evidence? Should any of it be taken as credible, or has any of it been disproven?
The way that people talk about it is that, well, since none of it has been disproven, that means it's credible. But the thing is, I mean, I could say to you, I think you're a Martian from outer space. Have you disproved that?
Right.
Like, how do you disprove that you're a Martian from outer space? And I think we need to apply that to the claims of the Steele dossier, which are just insane. They say that there's a P tape of Trump and Russian prostitutes. Well, has that been disproved? I mean, how do you disprove that there's a P tape? I mean, like, you have to show basically every single videotape in the world and show that none of them have, you know what I mean? So it's like,
Right.
I think the question is, has anything that was not already public by the time Steele wrote his memos been proven? And the answer is no. The Steele dossier claims that there's a P tape. Has that been proven? No, no, no. It claims that Michael Cohen went to Prague and met with the Russian hackers as part of the conspiracy. There have been reports in McClatchy that claiming that Mueller is evidence of that, but there's been no evidence to substantiate it, and I think that's an obvious fake story. And Cohen has shown his passport saying he's never been to Prague, and he's shown evidence that he was in California at the time when he was supposedly in Prague. But again, so like it's really hard to prove a negative. And if you look at the Steele dossier, basically there's like so much of it is based like there's a pattern where basically something gets reported in the media, and then afterwards Steele writes about it, but then spins it in a way that fits a narrative of a Trump-Russia conspiracy. So, for example, you had Carter Page, who's a volunteer Trump campaign aide, visiting Russia in July 2016. After that happens, Steele comes out and says that during that visit, Carter Page met with Russian officials and he made some secret deal where he was going to get like a major stake in the Russian state oil company worth billions of dollars if he gets sanctions removed. I mean, stuff like that. Then later on, it comes out that the Trump team changed the RNC platform when it comes to Ukraine, which is actually not what happened. What happened was just an amendment was rejected. But after that gets reported, then Steele comes out and says, sources say that there's a quid pro quo where Trump changing the platform in exchange for Russia's help to win the election. So basically, what Steele did, I think, is he took public stories and then put a spin on them. And one indication of the fact that Steele was relying on public stories is the fact that all these central figures in the Trump-Russia case, George Papadopoulos, the Trump volunteer aide who was apparently told about stolen Russian emails, Joseph Mifsud, the shadowy professor who reportedly told Papadopoulos about the emails, the June 2016 Trump Tower meeting between Donald Trump Jr., Manafort, Jared Kushner, and Natalia Veselnitskaya, and some others. All those things had happened by the time Steele wrote his first report, but none of them had been publicly reported yet. And accordingly, none of them show up in any of Steele's memos because they hadn't been reported yet. And so, amazing. What is most amazing about the Steele dossier is not just that the news media have taken it seriously. These wild claims that, like, when Trump was hosting The Apprentice, even before that him and Russia were developing this high-level relationship, and that basically Trump was working as a Russian asset. I mean, it's ridiculous on its face. But not only that, the FBI took it seriously. The FBI used it as a predicate for getting a surveillance warrant on Carter Page, and calling Steele credible. So it's like that's a shocking case where I think some biases inside the intelligence community, both against Trump and against his calls for better ties with Russia, led to some really questionable and derelict decisions.
Well, you mentioned the Trump Tower meeting, so let's talk about that, because that really is another big claim and flashpoint where the media seems to be focusing, saying that here you go, you have Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, all meeting with Natalia, and I can't pronounce her last name, Veselnitskaya.
Veselnitskaya.
So this really seems to be major evidence that there's a connection between the Russians and the higher ups, and not only the higher ups within the Donald Trump campaign, but his own son, So, I mean, what was this meeting, and how would you characterize it?
So the Trump Tower 2016 meeting starts with actually starts really the background to it starts in 2013 because that's when Trump put on the Miss Universe pageant in Moscow with the Agalarovs, a billionaire Russian, and his son who was a pop singer. So they became friends. And fast forward to 2016, and a publicist named Rob Goldstone, working for the Agalarovs, contacts Donald Trump Jr. and he says that the Agalarovs have a friend who or an associate who wants to meet with them because Rob Goldstone says, and I'll read it to you, they want to provide the Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary in her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father, right? And Goldstone goes on to say that this is part of the Russian government's support for Trump. Donald Trump Jr. responds and says, if this is what you say, I love it. And then a meeting happens between Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and then on the other side, this Russian attorney named Natalia Veselnitskaya and some other Russian associates. And when this comes out about a year later on, this is deemed to be the smoking gun because here you have the Trump campaign being told that the Russian government has incriminating information about Hillary Clinton, and it's a part of the Russian government's support for Donald Trump. And here you have Donald Trump Jr. saying, if this is what you say it is, I love it. So boom, it's a smoking gun, right? Well, if you look at this closely, I think it's anything but. First of all, Rob Goldstone, the publicist, later testified to Congress that he was basically freestyling, that the Agalarovs had not given him very much information. All they had told him is that they want to get a meeting for their friend Veselnitskaya. And so Goldstone, in his own words, when he talked about Russian government support for Trump, he says that was publicist puff. He was just trying to get the meeting for his client, and that's what he testified to Congress. And it turns out when the meeting actually happens. Oh, by the way, and people forget that even in Goldstone's email, he didn't say the Russian government has stolen emails that they want to give to the Trump campaign. He says official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary in her dealings with Russia, right? Which is something specific, and that's not anything to do with the actual stolen emails, which is a tell right there, I think. But anyway, when it comes to the meeting, according to all participants, the Russians had no actual incriminating information on Hillary. And what they wanted to do was basically lobby the Trump campaign against the Magnitsky sanctions because Natalia Veselnitskaya was working for many years on behalf of a firm called Prevazone to get those sanctions lifted. And by all accounts, the meeting ended after 20 minutes and nothing came of it. And it's, of course, possible. I mean, this goes back to the Steele dossier. It's possible that all this is a cover-up and that really in that meeting they hatched a plan for a Trump-Russia conspiracy. But it seems pretty unlikely that if there was going to be a high-level conspiracy that a music publicist would write it in an email. And the fact that Natalia Veselnitskaya, it's true that her big cause was for many years trying to get these sanctions repealed. So it makes sense that she'd be trying to do what she can to get them repealed. So much so, by the way, that she was working with none other than Fusion GPS, the very firm behind the Steele dossier. So
that's pretty suspicious.
So if the Russian government was colluding with the Trump campaign via Natalia Veselnitskaya, she seems to be an unlikely choice because meanwhile she's also working with the firm that is investigating Trump-Russia collusion. So like none of it makes sense, and of course, to date, no evidence has emerged to substantiate the suspicion that this is where a conspiracy was hatched. No charges have resulted from it. Donald Trump Jr. has testified to Congress about it. Rob Goldstone's testified to Congress. Veselnitskaya has testified to Congress. Veselnitskaya has been indicted, but for a matter totally unrelated to that issue. So no one's been indicted over it, and I think
what was she indicted for?
She was indicted on a vague charge having to do with, I believe, her deposition in a civil case involving the Magnitsky sanctions, but not directly to do with Trump Tower. And by the way, this indictment means that she'll never come to the U.S. now. So I suspect, I can't prove this, my suspicion is that this indictment was done for that reason because her testimony actually, I think, like the fact that she works with Fusion GPS And the fact that, I don't think there actually was a conspiracy in that meeting. I think her testimony undermines the entire narrative, and so I could see that there's a motive to keep her out of the U.S. And it's too bad. And if you read what she's been indicted for, it's pretty ambiguous. So I mean, look, again, it's possible Mueller comes up with something on that, but so far to date, I don't think you can say that anything has come out of the Trump Tower meeting.
Well, let's talk about the other Trump Tower, the one that was proposed to be built in Moscow. And this seems to be another point that the media focuses on a lot. And I believe that Cohen, now that he's flipped, has also somewhat admitted to or alluded to that he was serving as a conduit between Trump and the Russian government to get this Trump Tower built in Moscow. So is that the case, or just what's the story there?
No, Cohen hasn't admitted to being a conduit between Trump and the Russian government because there were actually no negotiations. All that happened is that Trump signed a non-binding letter of intent with like a Russian bank, which means nothing basically. It just signals Trump's intention to develop this project. There was no actual financing and no even approval for the project. After this letter of intent was signed, it was Cohen and his colleague Felix Sater who were working to make it happen, but they weren't getting anywhere. Felix Sater was promising Cohen all this stuff, but he wasn't delivering. So finally, Cohen took it upon himself to email a general email address at the Kremlin trying to get some help because he didn't even have a Kremlin contact. And he got a call back from the Kremlin saying, "Sorry, we can't help you." Now, what he's pled to is he pled to lying to Congress, that saying that he never heard back from Russia, and he pled to lying about how long the Trump Tower project was discussed inside the Trump organization. He said it was ended in January 2016, when really they talked about it up until June. And he's also admitted that he briefed Trump about it more than he told Congress. He told Congress he only briefed Trump about it 3 times. Turns out he briefed Trump more than that. But the notion that all this can lead us to a Trump-Russia conspiracy is pretty far-fetched because, again, this deal went absolutely nowhere. If anything, it shows that there was no Trump-Kremlin tie because it never had Russian financing, never had Russian approval. The only contact that the Russian government and Trump had on it was, again, when a Kremlin assistant called Cohen to tell him, "Sorry, we can't help you, but if you want to come visit, there's a St. Petersburg forum in June that you're welcome to attend." So that was the extent of the Trump-Kremlin communication about this project. But it's been spun into grounds for suspecting a conspiracy when I think, if anything, the evidence shows anything but.
So let's move into the last category I want to talk about, and that's miscellaneous or related crimes. And I think this also could fit into a characterization that some folks might have, is that, well, even if Trump didn't collude with the Russian government, he either, 1, obstructed justice by firing Comey, or 2, he covered up for other folks who may have colluded with the Russian government. So again, you have George Papadopoulos, who met with Russian agents in London and said that he had dirt on Hillary Clinton. You have the RT dinner with General Flynn and Jill Stein, where they're both right there sitting at a table with Vladimir Putin. And that in itself seems pretty damning, where Vladimir Putin is sitting there with, high-ranking Republican and the Green Party nominee. You have Flynn then admitting that he lied about lobbying, and you also have Paul Manafort and Rick Gates with money laundering and lobbying. So all of that together, I think that people in the media, people like Rachel Maddow and Chuck Todd, they'd say, well, that's a whole lot of smoke, so there must be some fire there.
Okay, well, first of all, I think the first thing to say about that is how many Trump officials have been accused of or indicted by Mueller of conspiring with Russians in any way during 2016? What's the answer?
0.
It's 0. Okay, so for all this smoke, there have been 0 indictments on this core question of collusion to date. And looking at them one by one, you can see why, because none of them connect us to a conspiracy between Trump and the Kremlin. So George Papadopoulos, you said that he met with Russian agents. That's the dominant narrative, but it's not true. He met with a guy named Joseph Mifsud, who is a who is a shadowy professor with all kinds of different ties, including ties, by the way, to Western intelligence, who, according to Papadopoulos, told him that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of emails. But there are no known ties between Mifsud and the Russian government, no matter what he may have told Papadopoulos. And that case has been resolved. Papadopoulos was indicted for lying to the FBI, and he served 12 days in jail. No evidence has come, despite extensive searches of all his emails and Trump emails. There have been no evidence that he even communicated any of this to his Trump campaign colleagues. And what I think actually happened, if Mifsud indeed told Papadopoulos this, I think he was referring to what was a big talking point at the time, which was Hillary Clinton's State Department emails, not the Democratic
Party. The 33,000 that we heard about so many times.
And that's what Papadopoulos thinks that Mifsud was talking about. And by the way, Mifsud visited the U.S. after Papadopoulos admitted to the FBI that they had spoken. Mifsud visited the U.S. in February 2017 at the invitation of the State Department because he was speaking at a conference. And the FBI interviewed him then, and he wasn't arrested. He hasn't been indicted. He was let go. So if he's a Russian agent, then why hasn't he been indicted, and why did the FBI let him go after they spoke to him back in February 2017, after they had found out what he had told Papadopoulos? So that's Papadopoulos. Who's the next one?
Flynn.
Okay, so Flynn went to an RT dinner before he had joined the Trump campaign.
And by the way, can we just talk about this RT dinner? Because, again, Jill Stein was there. I believe Ray McGovern might have been there. Maybe Jesse Ventura, if I'm remembering correctly. What was this RT dinner?
RT was turning 10 years old, and they had a gala. They had a big dinner, and they invited a bunch of people. I think Eric Alterman at The Nation was there, too. You know, he's like a liberal columnist. I mean, is he a Russian agent? Like, they invited a bunch of people, and they paid some people, including Flynn. They didn't pay Jill Stein. She paid her own way. And basically, you know, Flynn and Stein happened to be at the same table. And what happened was they weren't dining with Putin. Putin wasn't at their table sitting with them. Putin came into the room and sat there for a few minutes. And a picture was taken. And that has been spun into, you know, Putin, Flynn, and Jill Stein all dined. And what did they discuss? I mean, like, so that part is a joke. It's been spun into something huge.
And if you were going to conspire, I mean, that's a pretty bad place to conspire, right? At this big public event.
Yeah, and back in 2015, I mean, it's like it's silly. Okay, so but then Flynn, yes, he's pled guilty to lobbying, but not for lobbying to anything to do with Russia, but with Turkey. And in fact, Flynn's plea deal with Mueller, Flynn was not charged with the Turkey lobbying. It was alleged, but Flynn didn't actually plead to it. Flynn pled to lying about his contacts with the Russian ambassador. But, you know, this story has been pretty well debunked by now. First of all, the reason why this became a story is because the FBI had wiretapped those calls because they were wiretapping the Russian ambassador Kislyak. Well, if they have wiretaps, then we should obviously be able to see if there's anything criminal going on there. If Flynn and him are discussing a quid pro quo about sanctions, but none of that has come out, and none of that has been alleged. Basically, Flynn was accused of lying to the FBI about what he talked about with Kislyak, which, by the way, wasn't just about Russia. It was also about Israel because the Trump campaign wanted Russia's help in opposing a UN Security Council resolution that Obama, on his way out the door, was going to let pass that was critical of Israel, and Russia said no to that. And, you know, the contention by Flynn, or the suggestion by Flynn now, is that basically FBI officials entrapped him. And, you know, no matter what you think that what went on there, I mean, there's a lot of scrutiny of that. But the point is that the actual calls themselves, Flynn has not been indicted for anything treasonous or for any kind of scheme with the Russian ambassador. He was just indicted for misleading investigators about the nature of those calls. So that's Flynn, and it's, you know, and accordingly Mueller recommended no prison time for him. So if Flynn was involved in some kind of like collusion scheme, you know, Mueller hasn't alleged it, and no evidence has come out to substantiate it.
And I'm sorry, just what is the status of Flynn right now? Is he awaiting sentencing, or what's happening?
Well, he was going to be sentenced, and he probably was going to be sentenced to no time in prison because that's what Mueller recommended. But then his lawyers came out and they basically accused the FBI agents of entrapping Flynn in their submission to the court upon his sentencing, they basically accused the FBI agents of entrapping Flynn. So the judge, understandably called Flynn out. He said, "Well, you're pleading guilty, but you're also accusing these FBI agents of entrapment. So which is it?" And Flynn's lawyers backed off, and basically, after some confusion, they agreed to delay the sentencing. So he's still awaiting sentencing, and he actually might get prison because he was trying to have it both ways. He pled guilty, but then he also accused the FBI agents of entrapment. So we'll see what happens there. But regardless, there's nothing in that case on a conspiracy.
And I'm sorry, I know we're running over a bit, but I did want to talk about Paul Manafort too, because obviously, he's kind of a cartoonish, sensational type character. And apparently, he's had involvement with lobbying for Ukrainians, and he's been indicted as well for money laundering. I believe Rick Gates was also involved with that. And there's been some kind of back and forth of whether he's cooperating with the Mueller investigation or not. So I don't know if maybe just briefly you can explain what is the story of Paul Manafort.
There's two big things to know about Paul Manafort, I think. One is that his cases have nothing to do with the mandate of with the core of Mueller's mandate, which is the question of whether there was Trump-Russia collusion. I'll quote from you the judge in Manafort's first trial in the charges that Mueller brought. The judge said that the charges against Manafort, quote, manifestly don't have anything to do with the campaign or with Russian collusion. And then the D.C. judge in Manafort's second trial, before it was resolved with a plea deal, said that the collusion probe was wholly irrelevant to the charges in Manafort's case. That's because he's been charged with basically tax, bank, and lobbying violations pertaining to his work in Ukraine, well before the 2016 election, which Mueller, came up with over the course of his investigation. Now, the second thing to know is that the nature of Manafort's work in Ukraine, people try to argue that is relevant to the Russia probe because Manafort was serving pro-Kremlin interests in Ukraine. But the opposite is the case. Manafort, we talked about this earlier in terms of the lead up to this new Cold War between the U.S. and Russia. Manafort was working for Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president, and he was actually pushing him to sign that EU trade agreement that Yanukovych ultimately rejected. And that is made clear in internal documents released by Mueller in this case. Manafort was pushing Yanukovych towards the West. But because Manafort was working for Yanukovych, and because the narrative is that because Yanukovych rejected the EU, that he must be some kind of Kremlin stooge, that's been turned into the fact that Manafort was a Kremlin stooge as well, when the reality is anything but. So not only does Manafort's case have nothing to do with collusion in terms of the actual charges, it's tax, bank, and lobbying charges. Not only that, but even the nature of the work that he was charged for undermines the case for collusion, because during his time in Ukraine, he wasn't serving Kremlin interests. He was pushing back against them.
Well, again, I know we're running over. I appreciate speaking with you today. I did just want to ask you one last question. And, I think it's obvious why the media has really gone all in on this. I think that it's a matter of access to national intelligence officials, to politicians. Its ratings, it sells, it's a spy thriller. But I guess what I'd want to ask is, what is your prediction for how this is all going to both unfold and be remembered by history? I mean, when we look back 20 years from now, what is going to be the result of the Russiagate investigation, and how are we going to collectively, or how is the media maybe going to collectively remember it?
Well, I hope that there's like a museum collection of all the just insane displays of a conspiracy theory being mainstreamed. So all these pundits and anchors going on cable television and seriously saying that worrying that Trump was being controlled by Vladimir Putin, saying that that like Russian social media ads for sex toys and about Jesus were manipulating the American public, that stolen emails were the equivalent of Pearl Harbor and 9/11. All this insane conspiracy mongering that's been nonstop for 2 years. I hope one day that all of that is documented in a museum as just an example of how credulous and just crazy things got under Trump. And what I hope the narrative is about this whole thing is that basically you had neoliberal Democrats losing an election to one of the worst candidates ever, a reality TV show talk host. And then instead of taking responsibility for their own failures, both the policies that led to a lot of disenchantment with them and also their dumb campaign decisions, like not campaigning in Wisconsin and Michigan in the final months, and running ads that were very short on policy and mostly about attacking Trump's character.
And to initially promote Trump through the Pied Piper strategy.
Initially promoting Trump, and Bill Clinton even called Trump personally and encouraged him to run because Bill and Hillary and their gang thought that Trump would be an easy opponent. Basically, all these forces and a media that gave Trump billions of dollars in free advertising by constantly covering him. So I hope that it's recognized that basically Russia was used as a convenient foil, a scapegoat for their own failures. And it was a refusal to reflect on these failures that then propelled this ongoing fixation with Russian meddling and turning serious journalists into just fanatic conspiracy theorists willing to believe anything. And no matter how many mistakes they made in the process, refusing to let go of it. All of which, by the way, happened to serve national security state officials who had their own interest in taking on Trump that had nothing to do with opposing his worst policies, but having to do with trying to undermine a president who I think that they see as an ineffective manager of the empire that they've been a part of running for so long, and opposing the parts of his policies that they thought threatened their own interests. Or, for example, improving relations with Russia, because as I said before, tensions with Russia are dangerous for the world, but they're profitable for weapons manufacturers and for think tanks who sort of rely on this Russian threat and other threats to justify their big contracts and their paychecks. So I'm hoping one day that that's how this is looked at, but the jury's still out.
Well, Aaron Maté, I really appreciate you being on Primo Nutmeg today. I appreciate you also running over. There's a lot of things that we didn't talk about, so hopefully we can have you back to talk about those in the future. By the way, for folks who are interested in this discussion, where can they learn more about you and maybe read some of your work?
So I write at The Nation magazine. You can find my work there, and I'm also on Twitter at Aaron J. Mate. And I've done a lot of segments, video segments at The Real News, where I'm not there anymore, but all my segments on Russiagate are online at therealnews.com. If you haven't seen it, my most famous interview was where I interviewed Luke Harding, who is an author, a British journalist, actually, who wrote that story about Manafort allegedly visiting Assange in the embassy, in the Ecuadorian embassy, which is a transparently fake story. But I interviewed him about a year ago about his book called Collusion, and it's a very, I think, illuminating exchange about just how much evidence there actually is for the claims that people like Harding really take on faith that there was collusion.
Well, Aaron, again, thank you for your time, and I really like to have you back maybe in a few months to see, how this all pans out and how other narratives collapse over that time.
Sounds like a plan.
Thanks everybody for listening to this interview with Aaron Maté. If you did enjoy it, please do share it across social media. Also remember to like, follow, and subscribe to Primo Nutmeg on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and also on Minds.com. Once again, folks, the only way that this show is going to continue going is through your generosity. Once again, please do go to patreon.com/Primo Nutmeg. There you can become a patron for just $1 a month. And for that $1, not only will you keep this show going, you'll also get access to hours and hours of forgotten content from our earlier seasons, and you'll also get access to some exclusive patron-only content. Thank you everyone again for listening to today's show with Aaron Maté, and I hope to catch you back here next time on Primo Nutmeg.